Everyone. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Lindsay. So as Lindsay said, my name is Emily Suni Toman, and I was born in China, raised in the San Francisco Bay Area. Shout out to any NorCal folks I have in the room today. I'm adopted, and I'm in my first year of my PhD program at Brandeis University, which is just a little bit outside of Boston. Alrighty. So in today's session, we're really going to be breaking down the model minority myth. So we're going to start by examining it, really getting into what it is and how it presents. We're going to deconstruct it, how the model minority myth came about, what are its implications within and outside of the Asian American community, and then we're also going to debunk it. So thinking about how we can combat the model minority myth. Now, I recognize that really I'm only going to be speaking for about 20 minutes. These are all very complex issues, so I don't want to pretend as if we're going to completely understand or solve the model minority myth and figure out a way to completely debunk it within this session, but it'll be hopefully a good start. Okay. So before we really get into this, I am curious to know a little bit more about the knowledge that people are bringing into the space today. I recognize that we all have varying familiarity with this topic, and also just because I'm a PhD student doesn't mean I'm an expert or the only expert in this topic area. So what everyone else is bringing into this space, the knowledge that you have is equally as valid and important. So just to get started, I would like to know who has heard about the model minority myth before. You can either raise your hands on camera or just use a Zoom reaction. Let's see. So it looks like a few people see some thumbs up here. Okay, great, thank you. It's good to see. And then also I should say it's totally fine if you have not. This is meant to kind of cover it at like a basic level as well. And then how familiar are you with this topic? So please respond with one of the options in the Zoom survey. Rita, if you would be able to start the Zoom poll, that would be great. Okay, so we have some results coming in. Let's see. Alrighty, so it looks like, for the sake of time, I'm going to end the poll, but it looks like most people, let's see, share results. So it looks like most people are pretty familiar with this topic. And then we have some people as well who are very familiar with it. Okay, great. Thank you so much for participating in that. Let's see, so let's get right into it. Okay, so when we're thinking about the model minority myth, this is the definition that I think you'll probably come across most often, right? So the model minority myth at a glance is basically this stereotype that Asians and Asian Americans are meek, diligent, law-abiding, and successful model citizens. So this is on the surface level true, but I think it's important that we dig a little bit deeper and examine what we really mean when we talk about the model minority myth. So I've divided it into 3 different sections. So when we talk about model, there's some of the things that we associate with this word in the context of the model minority myth. So at the kind of top of this is really success, this idea that Asians have quote unquote made it in the United States. This kind of means like accomplish the American dream. And then also that Asians are quiet, intelligent, good at math, hardworking, law-abiding, meek, not political, and really an example of, a quote-unquote good minority. And so what we're really trying to tease out is not necessarily that Asians are not these things. So it doesn't mean that Asians can't be hardworking or intelligent or good at math, but it's that Asians are not these things solely because they are Asian. And it's really dangerous to basically attribute any of these things like intelligence on racial identity alone. And so again, I want to reiterate that these things are not inherently bad, like being intelligent or quiet or successful are not inherently bad, or that Asians are not these things or shouldn't be these things, but it's that we cannot say that purely because we're Asian, we are these things. And that's kind of often what happens when this model minority myth is presented. Alrighty, and then into the minority section of this, when we're talking about minority, we're really in the framework of this myth, are talking about Asian Americans, but more specifically, we're talking about Eastern Asians and or Asians with lighter skin tone. So I think it's really important that we name the role of colorism in this, and that certain people, certain Asians, the way that they are racialized in this country, have access to this myth, if you want to frame it that way, in a way that other Asians do not. So Southeast Asians, Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders, and then often like Western Asians as well, oftentimes do not have access to the quote unquote positive stereotypes that Eastern Asians and or Asians with lighter skin tones have. And tied up in this is this perpetual foreigner stereotype, as well as Orientalism. Perpetual foreigner is essentially a very common way that Asians are othered in this country. This idea that, we're not American, that we don't belong here. Phrases like go back to China, regardless of if you're Chinese or not, or, go back to where you came from. So those are like some common ways that this shows up, though I think if we're wanting to go a little bit deeper and get into a decolonial perspective, questioning what it means to be American, whether or not we want to be associated with what it means to be American, is something we can continue to think about. But for the purposes of this perpetual foreigner myth, we can focus on this idea that we don't belong in this country. And also Orientalism. So Orientalism being essentially like the imagination, exaggeration, and kind of almost fetishization of Asian people as being, different, inherently different than Europe and the United States and like Western culture. So basically it involves seeing Asian culture as exotic, but also uncivilized and backwards. And so it's essentially this strange place of being kind of, people are intrigued, but also because they don't fully understand it, there's an element of danger involved as well. And then also that we are not like other minorities, which is a theme we'll kind of continue to unpack. And then as it relates to myth, essentially, this is not true. And it goes back to the point that it's not saying that we are like Asians can't be hardworking or intelligent. It's just that it's not only because we are Asian or because of our cultural values that we are those things. And this term was also coined by a white man. So this is not a concept that really has come out of the Asian American community itself. This is something that a white man, a white sociologist, decided to essentially place on Asian Americans. And basically, it's also very harmful for Asians because, again, as we kind of touched on previously, it does not apply to all Asian subgroups. And also, it really erases a lot of the disparities within the Asian community. So if you look at income or educational attainment or likelihood to be in poverty, those statistics are very different if you disaggregate the data and look at like Chinese people versus, or in contrast with Hmong, Cambodian, or Laotian people. Like the statistics are very different, and so it's important to break that down. And also, just within, like if you take Chinese people, for example, not all Chinese people are good at math or test taking. I personally did horribly on the SAT, and so it's harmful for essentially everyone involved. And that means that sometimes in schools, Asian students don't receive the support and services that they really need, solely because teachers have this idea that, they're fine, they're gonna figure out a way to, they're gonna be successful regardless. And it's also, most importantly, I think we're going to kind of talk about this more as we get into the deconstructing portion of this. It's very harmful for other racialized groups because, and I'll continue talking about that more in depth. Okay, so thinking about how the model minority myth came about. essentially we're asking, how did we go from this, so images of yellow peril, Japanese internment, the Chinese Exclusion Act, how did we go from this to these images, you know, doctors, kid geniuses, you know, Asian kids playing the violin, and this article by William Peterson talking about, you know, how Japanese folks were able to go from internment to success in a very short period of time. So how did that narrative change? So essentially, there's a lot of history to this, but the short answer is that there were political incentives for the narrative to change, and this is basically true for a lot of change that has come about. Unfortunately, while we would love to think that white people in power were suddenly like, you know, we should maybe stop being so racist, the answer is that there were other political reasons why this narrative changed. So one of them was Soviet propaganda, was essentially calling out the racism in the United States. And so the United States, in response, didn't want people to suddenly start thinking that, you know, a communist country or communist society was like maybe, oh, maybe it's not so bad after all. So they decided essentially to combat this by propping up Asian success stories and saying, look at how successful all of these Asian people are. You know, racism is not a problem in this country because they've been able to find success. So the State Department really highlighted Asian artists, politicians, and even sent a Chinese American basketball team overseas. And so it was kind of this response to a lot of Soviet propaganda. And then also in World War II, when the United States needed allies abroad, especially to fight Imperial Japan, so they're thinking we could really use and benefit from an allyship with China. They thought, oh, well, maybe this Chinese Exclusion Act that we've had since 1882 might actually hurt an allyship with China. So why don't we get rid of that? So we have the Magnuson Act in 1953, which essentially repeals this and allows a very limited number, I think it's 105 Chinese migrants into the country every year. And it should be noted that this is still extremely disproportionate to the number of immigrants they were letting in from like Eastern European countries at the time. And then along with that, you have the Immigration and Nationality Act in 1965, a little bit later. And this essentially also created a 7-category preference system of who was allowed into this country. And basically, they really highlighted and gave preference to professionals and other individuals with specialized skills. So the 105 Chinese migrants they're letting into the country are most likely and disproportionately coming from professional backgrounds and have other specialized skills. And it's also important to note that while, you know, barriers related to Chinese folks are getting removed, you still have Japanese internment happening alongside all of this during World War II. So it's important to note that this really, you know, the narrative is starting to change, but not for every Asian group. And then another big piece of this is the civil rights movement in the mid-1950s to late 60s. Really looking at Asian success and pointing to it, it was dismiss and discredit the civil rights movement. So being able to say, if Asians have made it, then how come you haven't? And so in conflating, you know, the history like the histories of Black people in this country and Asian people in this country, they're essentially ignoring the different systemic barriers and institutionalized racism that in the ways that Black Americans have experienced it versus Asian Americans. The experience is very, very different. And so saying, essentially, if they've made it, why can't you, is erasing this, and it's dismissing the need to actually make institutional changes instead of just outworking a racist system, which is impossible. Okay, so in reframing the model minority myth, I think it's essential we look at this from a critical race theory perspective. So critical race theory essentially calls for us to explicitly name the barriers that are preventing us from having a just, equitable, and inclusive society, and specifically thinking about the intercentricity of race and racism with other forms of subordination, and really challenging dominant ideology. So as this relate, like, how does this relate to the model minority myth? Well, it's important that we view the model minority myth as being more than just kid geniuses and being good at math. So it's actually a lot more sinister, and you can kind of see this visually with racial triangulation. And racial triangulation was something that was developed by a researcher and professor, Claire Jean Kim. And essentially what you see is that the field of racial positions exists along two axes. So you have along your y-axis, a traditional kind of idea of racial hierarchy in this country, which is superior and inferior, with white people being the most superior, Asian people being less superior than white people, but inferior, more inferior than Black people in this country. But Kim essentially says, you know, we need to have, there are at least two axes when we're examining this. There's also along the y-axis, you know, foreigner and insider. So if you look at it along these, from a two-axis perspective, white people are both superior and insider, meaning that they are viewed as basically as belonging in this country. Asian Americans are viewed again as inferior to white people, but superior to Black people, but they're also viewed as not belonging in this country, which kind of gets back to the perpetual foreigner stereotype. Whereas Black people in this country are viewed essentially at the bottom of this racial hierarchy, but they're also viewed as belonging in this country. Now, yes, and so kind of essential to this is also understanding this middleman minority thesis, which is the idea that minority groups are being used as buffer groups or pawns between these two classes, elite and peasant. And so essentially in the United States, you know, different minority groups have occupied this role, and the way that Asian Americans do. If you think of like Korean American shop owners in Los Angeles, essentially middlemen minorities have a unique position in society where they operate between the elite and the masses. They also are able to find a little bit of financial success and possess a little bit of financial privilege in this country, but they're ultimately still excluded civically and socially in this country. So it's important to recognize that Asian Americans essentially are being used as a tool to ultimately reinforce white dominance and white supremacy. So it's not that we have outworked a racist system, or that our cultural values have basically made it so that we've found more success in this country. It's really just that we've been granted access, we've been granted kind of proximate power, but that problem is that it can easily be taken away, and it also basically rests on the further subjugation of Black people in this country. So I think COVID-19 is something that really highlighted this, right? Like before COVID-19, you probably didn't see as much news about Asian American, like anti-Asian sentiment, and then COVID-19 happened, and all of a sudden, you know, we kind of went from being this quiet model minority to suddenly being a virus. And so it can really change very quickly. So the power and privilege that we might have been able to find in this country is is conditional, and it is a false sense of power, false sense of privilege, and especially dangerous because it's very inherently anti-Black. So moving on, since I know we're getting close to time, thinking about ways to debunk the model minority myth, this is very complex. It's going to look different for everybody. So these are just kind of some broad ideas on how to do this. I think when most people think of debunking something, they think of externally doing this. So speaking up about Asian American experiences, reminding people that Asians are here and have opinions. I think this is especially important when we have conversations about race, not in a way that centers Asians when we're supposed to be centering Black, Brown, or Indigenous folks, but reminding people that, Asians also are people of color in this country. And so it's important that we also include them in discussions on race. And also really amplifying Southeast Asian, West Asian, Native Hawaiian, and or Pacific Islander voices. We want to make sure that Eastern Asians or lighter skinned Asians are not always at the forefront of conversations about Asians or Asian issues. We want to challenge racist and or microaggressive comments. So if someone says, like, you're really athletic for an Asian, you can say, well, what do you mean by that? And try and tease out, like, okay, so then basically you're implying that most Asians are not athletic, and we can kind of debunk that and understand like where those stereotypes are coming from. And I should add, this also includes calling out racist and microaggressive comments within the Asian community as well, about other racialized groups in this country. I would also say finding friends and a support system who actually support you and validate you and celebrate for who you are, and then returning the favor for them is a huge way to do this, especially if your friendships are cross-cultural or cross-racial. That's a very honestly radical thing in this country. And then showing up for our other marginalized groups. This can mean a lot of different things, but some examples are signing petitions, donating, protesting, learning about other group experiences, and then amplifying Black, Brown, Indigenous voices and buying from Black, Brown, Indigenous businesses. So there's knowledge, like an education piece to this. And then there's also kind of an economic piece to this as well. And really important first step, I think, in doing this and starting to show up for other marginalized groups and showing solidarity is to acknowledge and own up to your complicitness in anti-Blackness, colorism, and white supremacy. This is essential because I think we can't just suddenly pretend as if, like, I think after the events in the summer, I saw a lot of new accounts specifically saying like Asians for Black Lives Matter, which is great. Like, I like seeing this show of support, but I also did not see in a lot of these an acknowledgement of previous injustices that have that Asians have inflicted on the Black community. So I think it's really important that we acknowledge that and that we own up to that before we suddenly start saying like, oh, we're in solidarity with you. And then a really large part of this is internal work. So really reflecting, thinking about who is Asian in your eyes, what it means to be Asian, how you've internalized the model minority myth, and how you've internalized, benefited from, and perpetuated anti-Blackness and colorism. These questions require a lot of constant thought and reflection. And it's not just, it's not just thinking objectively about standing up for like Black people who you don't know, but it's thinking about how have I maybe been microaggressive to like Black coworkers, my friends, like really thinking and reflecting on that. And, unlearning harmful stereotypes about yourself and other racialized groups. So, have I internalized this harmful stereotype that I don't get political, that I'm quiet? That was something that I think I really internalized myself. And it took a lot of reflection and learning to realize that Asians actually like are political and can, do get involved in social movements. So I think releasing yourself from the need to fulfill or debunk a role or image of what you think others expect of you is important. I know I used to say, people think that I'm going to be quiet, so I'm intentionally going to be loud. It doesn't mean, like you don't want to not be true to yourself and who you are. So it doesn't mean that you now decide to go fail your math class because you want to disprove this myth that all Asians are smart or good at math. It just involves releasing the pressure to do that, to either fulfill or debunk the stereotype and just releasing yourself of that is huge. And also resisting the urge to perpetuate stereotypes of Asians as a self-defense mechanism. So making jokes about how you're really bad at math for an Asian because you're worried that people are going to make fun of you, or, you know, I think all of us, especially when we're younger, that is something that is a very common way to try and protect ourselves, by making a joke out of ourselves before someone else can do it. So I'd say resist the urge to do that. And then avoid gaslighting yourself. Your experiences are real and they are important. Like, for example, recently in class, I had a professor who was confusing me with another Asian student. And then after they apologized, I remember thinking, oh, maybe it wasn't that big of a deal. But it's important that you remind yourself that no, that is a big deal. I clearly felt upset about it enough to say something, and it was important that it got addressed. So avoid downplaying your experiences, because they are very valid. And then you want to recognize, most importantly, that our liberation is grounded in the liberation of other people, specifically Black, Brown, Indigenous, and or LGBTQIA plus folks, Black women, Black trans women, especially, because once they are free, we will also be free. So this is very important. This is very important to remember as we're kind of talking about equity and social justice and racial justice in this country. And then finally, I want to leave you with this quote by Patricia Hill Collins. She's an amazing Black scholar, and she's done a lot of work around, I should just say, she's an amazing scholar, specifically related to Black feminist thought. But I wanted to leave you this quote. So despite longstanding claims by elites that Blacks, women, Latinos, and other similarly derogated groups in the United States remain incapable of producing the type of interpretive analytical thought that is labeled theory in the West, powerful knowledges of resistance that toppled formal social structures of social inequity repudiate this view. Members of these groups do in fact theorize, and our critical social theory has been central to our political empowerment and search for justice. So essentially, you don't need to be an expert, you don't need to be established to contribute important knowledge in this country. Just purely by being yourself, by being Asian, by being Black, by being a Black woman, what you say is valid and important, and it is going to be essential in changing this country. So I want you to remember that. Okay, thank you so much for listening. I know I went over time a little bit, but now Lindsay's going to lead us in a few activities.